Thanks, Allison. You're the ultimate wing woman. I'll sit so you can sit too. This is what happens when you're 5 feet tall. You need a rope to get up on the chair. Yes, it's a stool. So this has been a really awesome year for brand trust because we were able to really look at the world, we were able to dig into the data, and what we found is so many parallels to purpose, which is super important to what we're hearing from our clients today. How do we action on purpose? So if we go to the next slides, Allison did a great job of introducing us, so we'll blow through this one and the next one. And we'll sort of start off with really our big insight this year, which is the collapse of the purchase funnel. It's a little teaser, but we want to sort of give you a warm open to really understand the context of what's going on in the world today. So if you go to the next slide, this one is a bit of a build, but we get the same question from our fearless leader, Richard Edelman, every year when we sit down to do brand trust. He's like, Courtney, Allison, Jackie, what is really different this year? Give it to me straight. And the truth is, it's 2 to 3 years post-pandemic, and we're finally starting to see so much transformation. So my answer to him was, Richard, everything has changed. And because of that, we see a consumer that is feeling this very deep sense of vulnerability. They are feeling this pressure from every angle of the world today. So we see in our data here, obviously climate change, it's no longer just this theoretical thing. It's coming in the form of smog. If those of you who have been to New York lately, the sky was orange just a few weeks ago, so it's very visceral and tangible. We saw this year for the first time, 58% say they feel threatened by their rights and freedoms. That was not something that really popped onto the radar. We're also seeing that come through very strongly with our Gen Z audience. And then, of course, inflation and misinformation. People are wondering how they're going to heat and eat, and this is leaving them feeling very vulnerable. And vulnerability is a very specific emotion because it's unlike fear. People run from fear. They're reactive with fear. With vulnerability, what we're seeing is a much more thoughtful, proactive consumer, which actually gives brands great opportunity to do more with them. So, of course, we see this vulnerability really shift the business of brands. So if we go on to the next slide here, the first place that we're starting to see this is really what they're expecting and what they're demanding from brands. Pretty shocking that almost 3/4 of them say that because of that deep vulnerability they're feeling, what they expect from brands is, first and foremost, safety and security. This is a bit different than we've seen in the past, where they're looking to brands to entertain them and thrill seek them and look for a sense of adventure. They actually do want that sense of safety and security. I know Margot's going to talk a little bit about that safety that Gen Z specifically is craving. And since last year, we see that this vulnerability and this quest for safety really is translating into consumers putting brands under a deeper sense of scrutiny. So 68%, of course, are more price conscious with inflation. They're doing much more research today than ever before, and they're actually not being frivolous with their purchases. And of course, this year, we're also seeing that given the events of the last year, they're much more likely to consider things like my health impact. And with consumers like Gen Z, health means something so much bigger and so much more than it does with older generations. And of course, the health of the world, the health of the environment. So, of course, with us, what we really zone in on is trust. This is our DNA, this is what we do, and with that strong foundation of trust, that is the foundation with which we can build sort of a strong relationship and buying dynamic, which we're going to talk about related to the purchase funnel here in just a second. But what we see here is when consumers feel vulnerable, that urgency for trust grows stronger. 71% say that it's more important than ever for brands to really develop that trusted relationship than in the past. And shockingly, trust is actually now within the top 3 consideration set for purchase. Of course, we see good value and quality. You need to actually be a brand that works for me. but importantly, you also have to be something that I can actually trust. All right. Hi. All right, first of all, pardon the cough. I don't have COVID, it's from a cold 3 weeks ago. But when it comes to how brands think about building this trust, the first thing they need to think about is who's influencing this trust. Last year, our data revealed just how big Gen Z's sphere of influence is. And this year's data not only continued that trend, but deepened it. Gen Z is influencing our oldest generation and everyone in between. They're also raising the stakes for brand trust. Gen Z's need for brand trust is the highest at 79%. It's an 8-point increase from last year. And they're expecting brands to really have an active part in building that trust. So when it comes to Gen Z, it's a generation that grew up in unprecedented times, and also they're just younger. So it makes sense that they're the most vulnerable generation. Because of this, they have higher expectations for what brands say and do. So looking at this, Gen Pop, Gen X is really okay with brands just showing their values at the point of purchase. But Gen Z, if you're not offering up what your values are and the kind of work you're doing to address those values, they're going to automatically assume that you have something to hide. So because of this, built-in trust and just in general the influence Gen Z has, it's not just among the people who are trendy, it's the whole general population and Gen Z's impact on the entire buying ecosystem. 68% of the general population say that Gen Z is influencing every generation. This is a 7-point increase from last year, and it's important to note that 12-point increase in boomers too. This impacts how everyone interacts and buys, so whether that's buying online and through apps, how people give feedback to brands, and how people interact with brands on social media. All right, so I will tell you, I've been doing brand trust now for the last few years, and this is the first time we actually killed something in the process. So this year, we killed the traditional purchase funnel, and it became very evident through our research. Actually, I've been in this industry for a very long time, and we've always sort of hailed the funnel as being the holy grail of what we really look at, and our data this year actually revealed something a little bit different that actually transformed the way we think about this collapse of the funnel. So it's broken. It's broken to the point where we can't resuscitate it. And what we found today is that the relationship is just too dynamic to really account for this traditional purchase funnel. And it's broken for a few different reasons. One, our data actually shows us that purchase is no longer just the endpoint. In fact, if I think about even how I purchase, sometimes it's much quicker. I make snap judgments. I make some purchases, and then I really get into the trenches of what that means with the brand. Actually, if you want to go back just for 1 second, we've been talking a lot about this for the last several years, that consumers are not robots. They don't really behave in sequential stages, yet that's what the funnel really accommodates for. Interestingly, what we also found is that it doesn't account for an ongoing relationship. When you think about the funnel, it really just looks at one dimension, the consumer dimension. It doesn't account for the brand and really that strong, familial, almost matrimonious sort of relationship that happens between brand and consumer. And then, of course, it's much more focused on the transaction versus that foundation of trust that's really important. So if we want to go ahead, perhaps one of the more eye-opening stats this year was really starting right off with when purchase is actually happening. And what we found is when actually research is happening. So oftentimes people are making purchases, 78% are actually making their purchase and then deciding, to actually do research with the brand after that first purchase. And we see that most people do most of their research after they buy. So that deepening sort of understanding is happening at much later in the process. It's not a series of stages. It's certainly, they want this ongoing relationship with brands. They want to interact directly with brands beyond just their product and service. They want to consume brand content. We see about 80% of people are saying they want to participate in activities. We actually saw this last year coming to the fore online as well. They actually want brands to be part of their communities. They want brands to participate. They don't want them to lurk. They don't want brands to be in their communities just to learn from them. And it really gives them opportunities to just evaluate a brand, what they stand for, gather information, and actually uplift them. And brand engagement obviously builds that trust. So in our 20 years of studying trust here at Edelman, we actually found that trust is multidimensional. It comes through in competence, in ethics, and in relevance. And when you're able to sort of build this multi-pronged relationship, we see that these trust scores across these dimensions really rise as well. And trust drives growth, and growth is really the holy grail of this. So we see that when we're able to really bolster that trust, we see that purchase increases, advocacy, loyalty, so on and so forth. So this year what we actually found, if you go on to the next slide, is that the new growth engine for brands actually isn't a funnel at all. It actually looks much more like a loop. And there's a few points here that really came to the fore. The first is in the little black loop that's sort of horizontal here. We see the relationship between attraction and engagement. So we found is that they aren't linear, that actually you become attracted to a brand the more you engage with it, and the more you engage with it, the more attracted you become with it. And that really relates to a brand setting too. So how they communicate, but of course the actions really going on behind it. Trust sits at the center of that, and with that becomes that sort of purchase and advocacy that goes along with it.
Yeah, so I think it's pretty clear that the cycle for brand trust and the purchase funnel has changed quite a bit in the past year. Coming out of the pandemic and the political shifts we've seen, there are a lot of new feelings in consumers, a lot of new influences and new business models. And it's really important in this environment for brands to take action. But how exactly do brands do this? So the first thing is to note that brand action is important. People want to see brand action. When brands act, consumers act in return. So when brands take solid commitments to key issues, like impacting environmental change, improving healthcare, ending racism, etc., consumers are more likely to engage with that brand and deepen their commitment to that brand. These issues are especially important to Gen Z, which becomes important to brands when you remember how influential Gen Z is on every other generation. So you can influence this brand trust and take action in a lot of ways. One of the ways is through influencers, but these voices don't have to be one size fits all. In fact, a diverse variety of voices can actually improve your brand credibility. And as you can see, a scientist can be just as influential as an everyday person or even an employee of a company. So I think coming out of the summer, a lot of brands are really aware of the risks that taking a stand can have. But it's important to note that you can take a stand without taking a side. Even in this very polarized environment, there is still bipartisan support for brands to take a stand on key issues. It's just really, really important that you go through the process of identifying the key issues that are not only relevant to your consumer base, but also relevant to you. But when you do this, like I said, it increases engagement and commitment and loyalty with those consumers. So it is impossible to ignore the risks, but luckily we've identified a couple ways where taking a stand can really go wrong with brands. So 76% of consumers say that things can go wrong when a brand loses sight of its audience. So if their actions are not relevant to their audience or are intrusive in the group they're taking a stand in. And 51% of consumers say that things can go wrong when brands say something that is not authentic to that brand. But it's important to note that authenticity is much more important to Gen Z and millennials than older generations. Yeah, and finally, because our youngest generations, our most influential generations, are so vulnerable, Gen Z is very willing to share things about themselves, and they relate more to brands that not only identify that vulnerability, but are willing to help them work through that, and are also willing to share a lot about themselves. So practices like being transparent about your operations, being open on key issues, working with the government on issues that are relevant to your brand. All of these things are really powerful in today's consumer base. Operating transparently is definitely important in crisis situations, but it's also important in your day-to-day. Building brand equity is not just about promotional anymore, it's also about your reputation. And when you have both of those things in line, trust can be born, and that trust loop that Courtney talked about is sustained.
Okay, so 3 things that you should walk away with today if you took nothing away from our presentation. It's these 3 things. 1, move beyond the funnel. We killed it. We think you should too. We're actually working right now to really put together a strong measurement framework around this, because we know that this is not just a pretty picture, but this comes with it some strong conversion metrics. So move beyond that funnel and really start to think of this as a much more reciprocal type of relationship between consumers and brands, understanding that engagement and attraction really fuel each other.
Yeah, the second one is work with Gen Z. Gen Z is becoming the face of global commerce. Even if they're not your key audience now, they will be in the future, and even now they're having influence over your key audiences. They like having that influence, we like being heard, and it's probably easier now more than ever to work with Gen Z, because you probably have Gen Z peers in the workplace.
And the last is trust over transaction. We believe strongly in trust because it actually drives to growth in ways beyond just a transaction. We think about, as a strategist, how we have conceived of positioning and strategy. It's always been very need-based, which is super transactional. Today, if we imagine that positioning through the lens of vulnerability, we can be much more trust-oriented. For us, do we have any questions? How are we doing on time? Okay, good. Questions? Yes?
Yeah, can you tell us more about the measurement strategy? Because I think in the traditional funnel model, there's so much around attribution and ROAS, so if it's a continual loop, do we look more at lifetime, long-term value? Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so what we're trying to measure right now is the tangible output of trust on growth. And so, we've actually simplified it a little bit to attract, interact, and act along that continuum. And what we're going to try and do is sort of conceive of conversion metrics along those lines, but also really understand, when you strengthen one, what is sort of the correlation to the next. So we're at the early stages of that, but that's sort of where we are at the moment.
We got lots of time for questions again.
Go ahead.
Thank you for your presentation.
Sure.
Are there brands that you see leading the way in this space?
Yes. Actually, I will start with you. Do you want to start with Gen Z, or do you want me to go first?
Sure, yeah. So I think, like I said, Gen Z really looks to action and putting your money where your mouth is in terms of building that brand trust. And I think a couple companies that fall into this category are outdoor sportswear brands. Patagonia, for example, has a long history of donating to nonprofits that are really focused on addressing climate change. And more recently, their CEO actually decided that when he retires, any profits that are made from the company and aren't necessary to running the company will be donated to a trust that will continue to address climate change. That's huge. That's a huge point of proof. It shows the company's not just about making a profit that's going to go to some person we don't know. They actually aren't just worried about, the impact of their products. They're worried about their impact as a company as a whole.
Yeah, we've also seen great success with Duolingo, Rare Beauty, in those spaces. Like, those are really strong brands, not just for Gen Z, but now knowing the influential power of Gen Z, how they're influencing their parents, their grandparents, and those around them as well. Yep.
What about, based on this behavior, is there such a thing for this target as a low involvement brand? Like, what about gum? Like, are they going to go down the rabbit hole and find out how it's made? What are they doing? Like, does low involvement exist for this target?
I would say yes. The same rules, I would say, still apply. You still have high involvement, low involvement. Like, their purchase of gum is going to look very different than the purchase of a baby car seat, right? So obviously, they're going to be doing more research up front in those high safety, high risk categories. But what I will say is there's much more room for failure. So yes, if you're a gum company, they're probably not doing that research after, but if they hear that you're a gum company that's polluting the earth or not doing something right, that trust loop can be broken as quickly as it can be built.
Yeah, I agree. Even if people aren't doing a lot of research about which gum brand they buy, it doesn't necessarily need to be a huge movement that changes consumer behavior, especially with social media. If one person finds out your company is, for example, using bad labor practices and underpaying your minimum wage workers, it just takes one viral TikTok to let a lot of people know about those brand practices, and that will change consumer behavior.
Your comment about educating after purchase, it made me think of these shoes that I bought recently. They looked cool, but then the company put more money in the box than I think I have ever seen. And not the box, it was the education. When I opened the box, I read everything in there. I read the letter from the person who made the shoes in South Africa. They spent so much time, and I really got into the brand and immediately went and learned more because they didn't look at the boxes. What's the cheapest way to ship it to me? It's how did they educate me? How they get me engaged in that product.
So what you just said there was interesting in that you bought a product, but you invested in a brand. And I think that's what our research is seeing. Buy a product, but you invest in your resources, your time, your energy into that brand.
But only because they gave me a reason to.
Correct.
Hi.
Hi, good to see you.
You too. So that's why I have to ask a question. I feel like the continuum of progress over perfection was you kind of got credit as a brand for trying, for working on it. Would you say that's starting to shift of it's not only progress, but you really have to be delivering, or do you think consumers are still embracing the fact that you're trying? Is there a difference?
I'll start, but then I also want your perspective as well. I would say there's much more emphasis being put on action now than ever before. So they're watching to see, sure, you can make a commitment and they'll take notice of it, but if you don't do anything and if you wait till 2050 to do something, then it's probably not going to be good enough. But I definitely want your perspective from a Gen Z standpoint.
Yeah, I think trying in progress is still really important. Owning to your mistakes and then trying to do something to fix the mistakes is really important up front. But I think Gen Z has a lot of mistrust in brands, especially big brands. And so even if you take action immediately, consumers might assume that your action does not have impact. So it's important to follow up any action with showing the results of that action. It's not the time to be quiet. Again, Gen Z will assume you have something to hide if you're being quiet. So if you're taking brand action or donating or taking stances, be loud about it. Be loud about it on social media, come with proof points, humanize the people that you've impacted and helped. All of that will really build brand trust.
What I will say is, coming off of Cannes this year, last year we came back, it was all about the problem to solve. This year it was all about the impact of that problem to solve. And many of these cases really took place just in the last year. So when juries go and sit down, not just for creative effectiveness, but they're actually looking for societal effectiveness as well. It is a barometer for whether or not you achieved your goal and whether you solved that problem or closed the gap towards that problem. Yes?
I really appreciated your comment about that you can take a stand without taking a side. And also, just coming back from Cannes, there's just so much chatter now about the extreme political polarization, which certainly has accelerated over the last year. So I was curious, did you have any data or insights kind of coming out of that can help brands navigate the fact that climate change is a very polarizing phrase for some Americans and very endearing to others? So how do you navigate that? I'm just wondering what came out of the study around that topic.
Yeah, it's funny you should mention that. We were just talking to our IP team about double-clicking on climate change. Because when you say climate change, it means so many things. And I think what we're really interested in is really bifurcating what that means. It could mean air pollution, it could mean water, it could mean farming for land. And I think it's about getting granular there. And so what our data tells us is that obviously climate change is important, but generationally and by sector, there's an opportunity to zone in, I think, more on the specifics of that and get very granular. What would you say about Gen Z?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Gen Z, is trending more liberal, but there's still plenty of conservative members of Gen Z that are very polarized and vocal, and I think part of taking a stand is like preparing to be caught up in the virality of negativity sometimes. But I agree, sometimes it's just about how you phrase it. Like climate change may be really polarizing, but cleaning up our oceans, like everyone can probably get on board with that. It's kind of like making sure you're not going to alienate a large part of your audience because, Gen Z is not a monolith. We're not all activists, so even among Gen Z, you can still alienate people. But yeah, like Courtney said, I think it's getting down to the nitty-gritty and figuring out how to phrase things so that people are not as willing to pick it up and make it go super viral on social media.
I'll give you an example. I work on an allergy brand, and it's obviously they want to take on climate change. And what we actually identified is that with pollution, with air pollution, it exacerbates allergies. And all of a sudden, our consumers' eyes lit up. It was an aha for them. They didn't know that air pollution actually exacerbated allergies. And so we were able to come at climate change in a way that made sense for the brand, but that was eye-opening for the consumer.
Plus, when you get more granular with how you're taking a stance, like focusing on air pollution specifically, you also tend to have a bigger impact instead of focusing on climate change as a whole.
One more? Go ahead.
So the funnel's broken. How do you see the funnel coming to life for products that are subscription products? Because we see a lot more subscription-based things showing up. How does that new funnel work with subscription-based products?
I actually don't know that I see a big difference. I'm curious as to, maybe we should follow up after this and chat because what I would say is, it's just as easy to cancel a subscription than it is to stop buying a product. What I do think is that there might even be more opportunity for subscription-based products because they're already in their email stream, they already have a strong CRM. So they should be taking advantage of that attract engagement loop that happens because they already have that sort of built-in relationship there. But I would say I think it still holds true, and in fact it's probably even stronger. But let's follow up after. All right. That sounds great. Well, we're here all day, so if there are any other questions, let us know. Thank you.